Everybody loves a good story, and the narrative paradigm by Walter Fisher is all about storytelling. Storytelling epitomizes human nature in all forms of communication, is the simple definition of Walter Fisher's narrative paradigm theory. And that's what I'm going to look at today. First, I'm going to look at Walter Fisher's original article, Narration as a Human Communication Paradigm, the case for a public moral argument. Second, I'm going to look at some criticisms to Walter Fisher's theory. And third, I'm going to look at Walter Fisher's own personal response to his critics. First, Walter Fisher's own article, written in 1984, he entitled it Narration as a Human Communication Paradigm, the case of a public moral argument. And this is where he first proposes his new theory. He defines narration as a theory of symbolic actions, words, and or deeds that have a sequence and meaning for those who live, create, or interpret them, which is different than the traditional definition of narration at the time, which was a fictional story told by somebody. Basically, that's not the exact definition, but that's the basic definition of what they thought. And it makes reason and rationality usable in all forms of communication. This is the first person to do that. He makes reason and rationality much more important in communication. And he has 5 key points to his theory. First, that humans are essentially storytellers, and we live our lives through stories. All we talk about, everything we communicate is a story of some kind. Second, the paradigmic mode of decision making is good reason. To make any decision, we need a good reason for it, is what Fisher is saying. We must have a good reason, or we're not going to do whatever it is wanted to do of us. Third, humans decide what good reason is through their own history, biography, culture, and character. We each have our own experiences. We're each taught different morals as kids, what we learned in school, and that's how we decide what is good reason for us. Fourth, rationality is determined by the nature of persons as narrative beings, and this encompasses 2 things. First, it includes narrative probability, which is the coherence of a story. Does the story fit together? Is it consistent? Do the characters do what we expect them to do? And second, testing the narrative fidelity, the truth of the story. Does it ring true with our beliefs, with our actions? And fifth, finally, the last key point to his theory is the world is a set of stories which must be chosen to live the right way. We decide which stories we're going to live our lives by, and the world is full of stories, and we must choose them. And now I'm going to look at some criticism for Walter Fisher's theory. And first and foremost, I'm going to look through one of the criteria for evaluating theories. I'm going to look at the theoretical scope. And the theoretical scope is determining whether a theory is narrow or broad. And Fisher's theory is very, very broad. And this is possibly his biggest criticism. And basically, it encompasses all communication. And that's just very, very broad. It even covers verbal, nonverbal, even abstract communication in his theory. And now some scholarly critics. Barbara Warnick, a communication professor at the University of Pittsburgh, writes an article in 1987 that the theory is problematic because of contradictions within. Fisher wasn't consistent with what he stated. She states that the status of traditional rationality and the extent to which it is to be applied is unclear. In some cases, Fisher said it's very important, and in some cases he says, it's not that important. Robert C. Rowland is the next one, and he was a communication professor at the University of Kansas, and in 1989 he wrote this article that put Fisher's theory to the test. And he states that the only way to see if an all-encompassing theory is truly all-encompassing is to test it with things that are not traditionally recognized as stories. He tested the theory in a book attacking a religious fundamentalism, a short film attacking Pat Robertson, and an allegorical science fiction novel. He tested the probability and the narrative probability and fidelity of each of these works, and determined that the theory and assume that the theory should be equally applicable for all of these if it is truly all-encompassing. He finds that the theory is of little use for these works, and he determines that it is of little use to things not traditionally seen as stories. It is only good for traditional stories. And Fisher has his own personal response to this criticism. He writes an article titled "Clarifying the Narrative Paradigm," and he singles out Roland's criticism in this article, and he summarizes his own theory by saying the narrative paradigm is a philosophical statement that is meant to offer an approach to interpretation and assessment of human communication, assuming that all communication is storytelling. He's basically saying that we must already assume that everything is a story. We can't pick and choose what's a story and what's not a story. And in this, he states everything is a story. So we must throw out our traditional ideas of a story and just assume that everything is a story. So now that I've looked at the theory through these three things, through Fisher's original article of the theory, through criticisms of his theory, and through Fisher's response to his own critics, I want to ask three discussion questions. First, can all communication really be viewed as stories, or are there some instances where there's just no way that that's a story? Do you agree with Fisher that everything's a story, or do you agree with his critics that you can't view everything as a story? Second, Fisher states that reason and rationality can be used in all forms of communication. Do you agree or do you disagree? And then third, this theory has been subject to a lot of criticism. Are the critics right and this is a flawed theory? Or is Fisher right and we can use this theory through every form of communication?